2 years ago, on Thanksgiving night 2005, Dr. Emily Hartwell disappeared after finishing a grueling 16-hour shift at Massachusetts General Hospital, leaving behind 2 young children, a devastated husband, and a turkey that would never be carved. The brilliant 37-year-old cardiologist, known for her unwavering dedication to saving lives, simply vanished into the Boston night, plunging her family into a nightmare that continues to this day, and leaving a community questioning how someone so vital, so present in everyone's lives, could just disappear. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here, we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. Emily Hartwell wasn't just another doctor at Mass General. She was the kind of physician who stayed late to hold the hand of a dying patient, who remembered the names of her colleagues' children, who never missed her own kids' school plays despite her demanding schedule. On November 24, 2005, she had volunteered to work the Thanksgiving shift so her colleagues with families could spend the holiday at home. The irony would haunt her husband David for years to come. "She called me around 7 p.m., David Hartwell recalls, his voice still breaking after 2 years. She said the shift was almost over, that she'd be home by 10 to help put the kids to bed, and maybe we could have a late dinner together. Sarah and Michael had already eaten, but they wanted to wait for Mommy to come home." That call would be the last time David heard his wife's voice. The evening shift at Mass General on Thanksgiving 2005 was unusually quiet. Dr. Hartwell had handled 3 cardiac emergencies throughout the day, all successful procedures that saved lives. Her colleagues remember her being in good spirits, even joking about how she was looking forward to sleeping in on Friday morning. At 9:15 p.m., security cameras captured Emily walking through the hospital's main exit, her medical bag in one hand, car keys in the other, looking like any other exhausted doctor heading home after a long day. But Emily Hartwell never made it to her car that night, at least not in the way anyone expected. When midnight came and went without Emily walking through their front door in Cambridge, David's concern turned to panic. He called her cell phone repeatedly, each call going straight to voicemail. He contacted the hospital thinking maybe she'd been called back for an emergency. The night supervisor checked the entire building. Dr. Emily Hartwell was nowhere to be found. At 11:30 p.m., David made the drive to Mass General himself, leaving his sleeping children with his neighbor. What he found in the hospital parking garage would become the image that haunted his dreams. Emily's silver Honda Accord, parked perfectly in her designated spot, engine cold, driver's door unlocked. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, wallet intact with $127 in cash, and all credit cards present. Her medical bag was on the back seat, stethoscope still hanging from the rearview mirror. The keys were in the ignition. The Boston Police Department treated Emily's disappearance as a missing person case initially, not a crime. "Adults have the right to walk away from their lives," Detective Robert Chen explained to a frantic David Hartwell. "We see it more often than you'd think. Stress, depression, marital problems. Sometimes people just need to disappear for a while." But David knew his wife. Emily wasn't the type to run away, especially not without her children. Sarah, 8, and Michael, 5, were her world. She had never spent a night away from them except for medical conferences, and even then she called home 3 times a day. The suggestion that Emily had voluntarily abandoned her family felt like another knife wound to David's already shattered heart. As Thanksgiving weekend passed into a cold November week, the search for Emily Hartwell intensified. Volunteers combed the woods around the hospital, divers searched the Charles River, and missing person flyers with Emily's bright smile appeared on every lamppost in Cambridge and Boston. Local news stations ran her story nightly. The medical community rallied around the search. Dr. Emily Hartwell was loved by everyone who knew her. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the harsh reality began to set in. Without any evidence of foul play, without any witnesses, without any leads, the case grew cold. By spring 2006, Emily Hartwell had become another statistic, another missing person file in the Boston Police Department's archives. The last official search for Emily was conducted in August 2006, 9 months after her disappearance. After that, the case was quietly transferred to the Cold Case Division, where it would sit, forgotten by everyone except the family that refused to give up hope. In the months following Emily's disappearance, the Hartwell family learned that grief doesn't follow a timeline, and hope can be both a blessing and a curse. While the rest of Boston moved on, forgot about the missing doctor from Mass General, David Hartwell found himself trapped in a nightmare that had no ending, no closure, no answers. The silence from the police became deafening, and the weight of raising 2 children while searching for their missing mother was slowly destroying him. Sarah, now 9, stopped asking when Mommy was coming home around month 4. The bright, talkative little girl became withdrawn, her grades slipping as she struggled to understand why everyone else's mothers picked them up from school while hers remained a ghost, present only in framed photographs scattered throughout their Cambridge home. Michael, barely 6, began having nightmares, calling out for Emily in his sleep, sometimes forgetting she was gone and asking David where she was hiding. The hardest part wasn't the not knowing, David reflects, sitting in the same kitchen where Emily used to make pancakes every Sunday morning. It was watching my children slowly forget their mother's voice. Sarah started calling her the lady in the pictures, and Michael asked me if Mommy was pretend, like the characters in his storybooks. The investigation, such as it was, had stalled completely by early 2006. Detective Chen, overwhelmed with active cases involving clear evidence of crimes, could spare little time for a missing person case with no leads, no witnesses, and no signs of foul play. The searches had turned up nothing. Emily's bank accounts remained untouched. Her credit cards showed no activity. Her cell phone had been found 3 weeks after her disappearance in a dumpster behind a convenience store in Somerville, its SIM card destroyed. Dr. Richard Blackwood, Emily's supervisor and head of cardiology at Mass General, appeared genuinely devastated by her disappearance. He organized memorial services, spoke at press conferences appealing for information, and privately assured David that the hospital was doing everything possible to cooperate with police. Emily was like a daughter to me, Dr. Blackwood told Boston Globe reporters in February 2006. She was the most dedicated physician I've ever worked with. Her loss has left a hole in our department that can never be filled. But even Dr. Blackwood's support couldn't fill the growing void in the investigation. By summer 2006, the weekly check-ins from Detective Chen had become monthly calls, then quarterly updates that contained no new information. The case was dying a slow, bureaucratic death. David's own investigation had hit similar walls. He hired a private investigator in March 2006, a former Boston PD detective named Margaret Torres, who specialized in missing persons cases. Torres was thorough, experienced, and compassionate, but even she found herself chasing shadows. Emily's last known movements were captured on hospital security cameras at 9:15 p.m. on November 24, 2005. After that, it was as if she had simply ceased to exist. "I've worked hundreds of missing persons cases," Torres told David after 6 months of investigation. "Adults who disappear without a trace usually fall into one of 3 categories. They've left voluntarily and are very good at staying hidden. They've been killed and the body has been carefully concealed, or they've been trafficked." Given Emily's profile, a respected doctor, a devoted mother, no history of depression or financial problems, the first option seems unlikely. The possibility that Emily had been murdered was something David had tried not to think about, but as 2006 wore on, it became impossible to ignore. If Emily was dead, if someone had killed her that Thanksgiving night, then her murderer was walking free, while her children grew up without their mother. The injustice of it consumed David, turning his grief into something harder, angrier. The medical community's initial rallying around Emily's disappearance had faded as well. Mass General had replaced her position, removed her nameplate from her office door, and generally moved on as hospitals must when they lose staff members. The administrative efficiency of it all felt like a betrayal to David. Emily had given her life to that hospital, literally working herself to exhaustion trying to save others, and within a year, it was as if she had never existed there at all. Christmas 2006 was particularly brutal. Sarah had asked for only one present, her mother to come home. When Christmas morning arrived without Emily, something broke in both children. Michael stopped talking about Mommy altogether, while Sarah began acting out at school, getting into fights with classmates who complained about their own mothers. "I realized that my kids were not just losing their mother," David says, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were losing their childhood, their sense of security, their faith that the adults in their lives could keep them safe, and I was failing them because I couldn't bring Emily back." The second anniversary of Emily's disappearance, Thanksgiving 2007, found the Hartwell family in a very different place than they had been 2 years earlier. David had started seeing a therapist. The children were in counseling, and the family had begun the painful process of trying to build a new life without Emily. But David's search for his wife had never stopped. It had just become more private, more personal. He had converted Emily's home office into a makeshift command center, filling it with copies of police reports, hospital records, maps of Boston marked with search areas, and boxes of Emily's personal belongings that he went through obsessively, looking for clues that everyone else had missed. Friends and family worried that David was becoming obsessed, that his refusal to accept Emily's death was preventing him from moving forward. They had no idea that David's obsession was about to pay off in the most unexpected way possible. March 15, 2007. 16 months after Emily vanished, David Hartwell made a decision that would change everything. With Sarah asking more questions about why Mommy's office was still exactly as she left it, and Michael starting to have nightmares about the scary room filled with boxes, David finally decided to pack up Emily's home office. What he thought would be a painful but necessary step toward healing would instead crack open a case that had been declared unsolvable. Emily's office had been her sanctuary, a small room off the main hallway where she paid bills, reviewed medical journals, and occasionally brought work home from the hospital. David had barely touched it since her disappearance, except to move some of her personal items there from Mass General when the hospital cleaned out her locker and desk. Now faced with boxes of medical textbooks, professional journals, and personal papers, David felt like he was dismantling the last physical evidence of his wife's existence. "I started with the medical books," David recalls. "Emily had dozens of them, mostly cardiology textbooks and surgical manuals. I was going to donate them to the medical library at Mass General, something Emily would have wanted." As he lifted each heavy volume, David found himself reading the margins where Emily had made notes, seeing her handwriting one last time in the careful annotations she'd made during her residency and fellowship years. It was while packing Advanced Cardiac Procedures 4th edition that David felt something unusual. The book was heavier than it should have been, and when he opened it, he discovered why. Pages 247 through 298 had been carefully cut out, creating a hollow space just large enough to conceal a small USB flash drive. David stared at the device for several minutes, his hands shaking. Emily had been meticulous about digital security. She never brought patient information home due to HIPAA regulations, and all her personal files were kept on her laptop. What could be on this hidden drive that she felt the need to conceal it inside a medical textbook? When David inserted the USB drive into his computer, he found 3 folders: Personal, Evidence, and Insurance. The Personal folder contained what appeared to be drafts of emails, most of them never sent. The Evidence folder held financial documents, patient records, and correspondence. The Insurance folder contained a single document titled, "If Something Happens to Me." As David began reading, he realized he was looking at a side of his wife's professional life that he had never known existed. The drafts in the Personal folder were emails to David himself, messages Emily had written but never sent, explaining a situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous. "My dearest David," one draft read, "I don't know how to tell you this, but I think I'm in serious trouble at the hospital. I've discovered something terrible, and I'm afraid that if I report it, there could be consequences not just for me but for our family. Dr. Blackwood has been... I can't even write it. People could die because of what I know, but people could also die if I speak up." Another unsent email dated November 20th, 2005, just 4 days before Emily disappeared, was more explicit. "I have copies of everything now. The falsified surgical reports, the unnecessary procedures, the billing fraud. Richard thinks I don't know about the patients who died from surgeries they didn't need, but I do. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Gonzalez, Ms. Chen, all of them had procedures that Richard recommended, despite my medical opinions, stating they were too high risk. They died because Richard needed to maintain his surgical numbers for the department." David's blood ran cold as he continued reading. His wife hadn't just discovered medical malpractice. She had uncovered what appeared to be a systematic scheme involving unnecessary cardiac surgeries performed on elderly patients for financial gain. Dr. Richard Blackwood, the man who had spoken so eloquently at Emily's memorial services, the man who had personally assured David that the hospital was doing everything possible to find Emily, was apparently the subject of her investigation. The evidence folder contained documentation that would have ended Dr. Blackwood's career and likely sent him to prison. Emily had meticulously gathered copies of patient files, billing records, and internal hospital communications that showed a pattern of surgical recommendations that prioritized profit over patient welfare. The documents indicated that over a 3-year period, Dr. Blackwood had performed over 200 cardiac procedures that were either unnecessary or inappropriate for the patient's conditions. More chilling were Emily's notes about her attempts to address the situation through proper channels. She had first approached Dr. Blackwood directly in August 2005, expressing concerns about specific cases. When he dismissed her concerns and suggested she was overthinking the medical decisions, Emily had taken her evidence to the hospital's ethics committee. According to her notes, that complaint was buried, and Emily was told to focus on her own patients and stop questioning her supervisor's judgment. The final document Emily had created, the one in the insurance folder, was clearly written as a precaution. If you are reading this, something has happened to me, and it's likely connected to my investigation into Dr. Richard Blackwood's medical practices at Massachusetts General Hospital. I have documented evidence of systematic medical fraud, unnecessary surgeries resulting in patient deaths, and billing schemes that have defrauded Medicare and private insurance companies of millions of dollars. I believe Dr. Blackwood became aware of my investigation in mid-November 2005, and I fear for my safety. The evidence is all here. Please take it to the FBI, not the Boston police. There may be people at the hospital who are involved or who have been paid to look the other way. Trust no one from Mass General except Dr. Patricia Morrison in emergency medicine. She can verify everything I've documented. David sat in Emily's office until dawn, reading and rereading the documents his wife had hidden. Everything made sense now. Emily's distracted behavior in the weeks before her disappearance, her unusual stress levels, her reluctance to discuss work problems. She hadn't been having an affair or suffering from depression. She had been gathering evidence against a killer and trying to figure out how to expose him without destroying her own career or putting her family in danger. As the sun rose over Cambridge on March 16, 2007, David Hartwell finally understood what had happened to his wife. Emily hadn't disappeared because she wanted to escape her life. She had been silenced because she had discovered the truth about Dr. Richard Blackwood. And now, 16 months later, David held that same dangerous truth in his hands. The question was, what was he going to do with it? David Hartwell spent 3 sleepless days after discovering Emily's hidden evidence, wrestling with a decision that could either bring his wife's killer to justice or put his own children in the same danger that had likely cost Emily her life. The USB drive sat on his kitchen table like a loaded weapon, containing enough explosive information to destroy one of Boston's most respected cardiac surgeons, and possibly the man who had murdered his wife. On March 19, 2007, David made a choice that would forever change the trajectory of the case. Instead of going directly to the FBI, as Emily had suggested in her final note, he decided to confront Dr. Richard Blackwood face to face. It was a decision born of grief, anger, and a desperate need to look into the eyes of the man he now believed had killed his wife. Dr. Blackwood's office at Mass General was a shrine to his success. Walls lined with medical degrees, awards, and photographs of him with Boston's political elite. When David arrived unannounced that Tuesday morning, Blackwood's secretary tried to turn him away, but David's raw emotional state and mention of Emily's name got him through the door. "David, Doctor," Blackwood said, rising from behind his mahogany desk with what appeared to be genuine concern. "This is unexpected. How are you holding up? How are Sarah and Michael?" For 16 months, David had seen Richard Blackwood as Emily's mentor, a father figure who had been devastated by her disappearance. Now, looking across the office at the distinguished 52-year-old surgeon with his silver hair and expensive suit, David saw something different. He saw a predator who had spent over a year pretending to care about Emily while knowing exactly what had happened to her. "I found something, Richard," David said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Something Emily hid before she disappeared." The change in Dr. Blackwood's demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. The concerned expression remained, but something shifted behind his eyes. "What kind of something, David? I know how difficult this anniversary period must be for you, Sometimes grief can make us see patterns that aren't really there. David pulled out a printed copy of one of Emily's draft emails, the one detailing Blackwood's unnecessary surgeries. He placed it on the desk between them and watched as Blackwood's face went completely pale. "She knew, didn't she?" David said. "Emily knew what you were doing to those patients. She knew about Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Gonzalez, Ms. Chen. She knew you were killing people for money." Dr. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Emily's words. When he finally looked up, the mask of concern had slipped completely. "David, you're clearly going through a very difficult time. These accusations they're the product of a grieving mind that's looking for someone to blame. Emily was a good doctor, but she was young, sometimes overly emotional about patient care decisions. Don't." David's voice was sharp now. "Don't you dare talk about Emily like she was some hysterical resident. She documented everything, Richard. Every unnecessary surgery, every patient who died because of your greed, every forged signature on surgical consent forms. She has copies of billing records showing you performed over 200 unnecessary procedures in 3 years. The silence in the office stretched between them like a taut wire. "Doctor." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since David had known him, the distinguished surgeon looked like what he truly was, a cornered predator. "Where is this supposed evidence, David?" Blackwood asked, his voice now cold and calculating. "Because if such evidence existed, don't you think Emily would have reported it to the appropriate authorities? The fact that she didn't suggests that maybe her concerns were unsubstantiated." "She tried to report it," David replied. "She came to you first in August 2005. When you dismissed her, she went to the hospital ethics committee. But that complaint was buried, wasn't it? How many people at this hospital are you paying to look the other way, Richard?" Dr. Blackwood stood up slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the hospital parking garage, where Emily's car had been found that November night. "David, I'm going to ask you to leave now. You're clearly not well, and these accusations are bordering on slander. If you continue making these claims, I'll have no choice but to pursue legal action." But David wasn't finished. "Emily wrote a letter, Richard. A letter explaining everything, including her fear that you might try to silence her. She wrote it just in case something happened to her. Prophetic, don't you think?" That's when David saw it, a flash of something that might have been panic in Dr. Blackwood's eyes. It was there for just a moment before the surgeon regained his composure, but it was enough. David knew with absolute certainty that he was looking at his wife's killer. "I think we're done here," Dr. Blackwood said, moving toward his office door. "I'm going to have security escort you out, and I strongly suggest you seek professional help for your grief. Making wild accusations won't bring Emily back." As David left Mass General that morning, he felt a strange sense of relief. For 16 months he had wondered if Emily was alive somewhere, if she had left voluntarily, if she might someday walk back through their front door. Now he knew the truth. Emily was dead, and Dr. Richard Blackwood had killed her to protect his deadly secret. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. As David drove home to Cambridge, he realized that confronting Blackwood had been a mistake. If the surgeon had been willing to kill Emily to protect himself, he certainly wouldn't hesitate to take action against David, now that he knew the evidence existed. That evening, after putting Sarah and Michael to bed, David sat in Emily's office and made copies of everything on the USB drive. He mailed one copy to his lawyer with instructions to open it only if something happened to him. Another copy went to his brother in California. The third copy, along with the original USB drive, went into a safety deposit box at a different bank from the one the family normally used. Then, against Emily's written advice to contact the FBI, David called Detective Chen at the Boston Police Department. If he was going to pursue this investigation, he needed law enforcement protection for himself and his children. What David didn't know was that his phone call to Detective Chen would set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring Emily home, but not in the way anyone expected. Dr. Richard Blackwood had spent 16 months believing that Emily's evidence had died with her. Now, faced with the possibility that his crimes were about to be exposed, he would have to make a choice: run or eliminate the final threat to his carefully constructed life. The clock was ticking, and David Hartwell had just painted a target on his family's back. Detective Robert Chen had worked missing persons cases for 8 years, but David Hartwell's phone call on March 19, 2007 was unlike anything he'd ever received. When David explained that he had found evidence suggesting Dr. Richard Blackwood had murdered Emily to cover up medical malpractice, Chen's first instinct was skepticism. Grieving family members often developed conspiracy theories to explain inexplicable losses. But as David read portions of Emily's hidden documents over the phone, Chen realized this wasn't a grieving husband's fantasy. This was a potential murder case with documented evidence. "I need you to bring everything to the station immediately," Chen told David. "Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't make any more copies. And for God's sake, don't confront Dr. Blackwood again. If what you're telling me is true, you've just put yourself and your children in serious danger." Chen spent the next 6 hours reviewing Emily's evidence, and with each document, each draft email, each meticulously gathered piece of proof, his amazement grew. Emily Hartwell hadn't just stumbled upon medical malpractice. She had uncovered what appeared to be one of the largest medical fraud schemes in Massachusetts history. The documentation was thorough, professional, and absolutely damning. More importantly, it provided a clear motive for murder. "This changes everything," Chen told his captain the next morning. "We're not looking at a missing person anymore. We're looking at a homicide, and we have a suspect with means, motive, and opportunity." The investigation that followed moved with a speed and intensity that had been completely absent from Emily's missing person case. Within 48 hours, detectives were interviewing Emily's colleagues, reviewing hospital security footage from November 2005, and examining Dr. Blackwood's financial records. What they found painted a picture of a surgeon who had been living far beyond his means, funding an expensive lifestyle through insurance fraud and unnecessary surgeries. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the emergency room physician Emily had trusted, confirmed that Emily had approached her in October 2005 about her concerns regarding Dr. Blackwood. Emily was terrified, Dr. Morrison told investigators. She said she had evidence that Richard was performing surgeries that were killing patients, but she was afraid to report it because he was so powerful at the hospital. She asked me what I would do in her situation. More damaging testimony came from hospital billing staff, who revealed that Dr. Blackwood had been pressuring them to code surgeries in ways that maximized insurance reimbursements, even when the procedures didn't match the coding descriptions. One billing clerk, Maria Santos, admitted that she had been falsifying records at Dr. Blackwood's direction for over 2 years. "He told me it was standard practice," Santos explained to investigators. "He said all surgeons did it, that insurance companies expected us to maximize billing, but some of the procedures he claimed to have performed, I knew they couldn't be right. The patient files didn't match the billing codes." As the investigation intensified, Dr. Blackwood's behavior became increasingly erratic. Colleagues noted that he seemed paranoid, frequently looking over his shoulder, and had started working later hours when fewer people were around. He had also begun asking unusual questions about the hospital's security procedures and whether cameras recorded audio as well as video. On March 27, 2007, exactly 1 week after David had confronted him, Dr. Blackwood made a fatal mistake. Security cameras at Mass General captured him accessing Emily's former office, now used by another cardiologist, and searching through files that had been left behind when her belongings were returned to David. What Blackwood didn't know was that Detective Chen had requested surveillance on all his movements as part of the investigation. He was looking for something, Chen explained to the prosecutor who would eventually handle the case, something he was afraid Emily might have hidden at the hospital. His behavior was that of a guilty man trying to cover his tracks. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Dr. Blackwood owned a second property that he had never disclosed on hospital employment forms, a small cottage in Wellfleet on Cape Cod that he had purchased through a shell company in 2003. The property was registered under the name of a medical supply company that existed only on paper, a company that had received over $200,000 in payments from Mass General's surgical department for equipment that was never delivered. On April 3, 2007, armed with a search warrant, investigators arrived at the Cape Cod cottage expecting to find financial records or other evidence of Dr. Blackwood's fraud scheme. What they found instead was something far more significant. Disturbed earth in the cottage's basement, soil that had clearly been dug up and replaced sometime in the recent past. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed what investigators suspected. There was something buried beneath the basement floor of Richard Blackwood's secret cottage, something approximately the size and shape of a human body. As the excavation began on April 4, 2007, David Hartwell received a phone call that he had been both hoping for and dreading for 16 months. Detective Chen's voice was gentle but firm. "David, we found Emily. I'm sorry. She's gone." The remains discovered in Dr. Blackwood's basement were confirmed through dental records to be Dr. Emily Hartwell. The medical examiner determined that she had died from manual strangulation, and fiber evidence on her clothing matched fabric from the interior of Dr. Blackwood's BMW, the same car that security cameras had captured, leaving the Mass General parking garage at 9:43 p.m. on November 24, 2005, just 28 minutes after Emily was last seen alive. Dr. Richard Blackwood was arrested at his home in Beacon Hill on April 5, 2007, as he was attempting to shred financial documents related to his fraudulent billing scheme. In his study, investigators found a printed copy of Emily's personnel file and a handwritten timeline of her work schedule from November 2005, suggesting that he had been planning her murder well in advance. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a letter found in Dr. Blackwood's safe, addressed to his wife and children, in which he wrote, "Sometimes in medicine we have to make difficult decisions to prevent greater harm. Emily Hartwell was going to destroy everything we've built, ruin the lives of everyone in our family, and damage the reputation of one of Boston's finest hospitals. I prevented that from happening. I saved more lives than I took." As news of Dr. Blackwood's arrest spread through Boston's medical community, more victims came forward. Families of patients who had died following unnecessary surgeries began filing lawsuits, and the Massachusetts State Medical Board launched a comprehensive investigation into Mass General's cardiac surgery program. Emily Hartwell had been right about everything. Her evidence had exposed a killer, saved future victims, and brought justice for the families who had lost loved ones to Dr. Blackwood's greed. But for David, Sarah, and Michael, the discovery of Emily's body marked the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another, learning to live with the knowledge of how their wife and mother had died, and why. If this case has already gripped you, hit the like button. It helps Emily's story reach more people. Dr. Richard Blackwood's trial began on September 15, 2008, nearly 3 years after Emily Hartwell's disappearance and 16 months after her body was discovered in his Cape Cod cottage. The case had become one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Massachusetts history, not just because of the murder charge, but because of the stunning revelations about systematic medical fraud at one of Boston's most prestigious hospitals. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Sarah Fleming, faced a unique challenge. While they had overwhelming evidence of Dr. Blackwood's fraudulent medical practices, proving that he had murdered Emily specifically to silence her required establishing a clear timeline and motive that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. This case is about power, greed, and the ultimate abuse of trust, Fleming told the jury in her opening statement. Dr. Richard Blackwood took an oath to do no harm, but for over 3 years he systematically harmed patients for profit. When Dr. Emily Hartwell discovered his crimes and threatened to expose them, he silenced her forever. The defense team, led by prominent Boston attorney Marcus Webb, attempted to portray Dr. Blackwood as a dedicated surgeon who had been making complex medical decisions under pressure, and suggested that Emily's death was either accidental or the result of a personal dispute unrelated to their professional relationship. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb argued, "the prosecution wants you to believe that my client, a respected surgeon who has saved thousands of lives over his career, is capable of cold-blooded murder. They want you to ignore the fact that Dr. Hartwell's accusations were never proven, that no medical review board found any wrongdoing, and that the so-called evidence she gathered was obtained illegally and without proper medical oversight." But as the trial progressed, it became clear that the defense's strategy was fundamentally flawed. The evidence against Dr. Blackwood was not just extensive, it was overwhelming. The prosecution's first major witness was Dr. Patricia Morrison, Emily's trusted colleague, who testified about Emily's growing fear in the weeks before her disappearance. "Emily told me that she had tried to address her concerns through proper channels, but that Dr. Blackwood had threatened her career if she continued to interfere with his surgical decisions," Dr. Morrison testified. "She said he had told her that nobody would believe a young female cardiologist over a department head with his reputation." More damaging testimony came from Maria Santos, the hospital billing clerk, who had been falsifying records at Dr. Blackwood's direction. Santos broke down in tears as she described how Dr. Blackwood had convinced her that insurance fraud was standard practice in high-volume cardiac surgery programs. "He made me feel like I was helping save lives," Santos testified. "He said that if we didn't maximize billing, the hospital wouldn't have money for new equipment, and patients would suffer. I believed him because he was a doctor, because I trusted him. I never realized that people were dying because of what we were doing." Perhaps the most compelling evidence came from the families of Dr. Blackwood's victims. Patricia Chen, whose 74-year-old mother had died following an unnecessary triple bypass surgery recommended by Dr. Blackwood, testified that her mother had been in good health and had only visited the hospital for a routine cardiac screening. "Dr. Blackwood told us that my mother needed immediate surgery, or she would die within weeks," Patricia Chen said through tears. "He made it sound like we had no choice. We trusted him completely. We never questioned whether the surgery was really necessary." Medical experts testified that Mrs. Chen's pre-surgical tests showed no indication for major cardiac surgery, and that Dr. Blackwood had falsified her medical records to justify the procedure. The surgery itself was performed competently, but Mrs. Chen died 3 days later from complications that would never have occurred if she hadn't undergone unnecessary surgery. Similar stories emerged throughout the trial. Robert Gonzalez, 68, had died following an unnecessary angioplasty procedure that Dr. Blackwood had recommended, despite test results showing minimal arterial blockage. Margaret Patterson, 82, had died from surgical complications after Dr. Blackwood convinced her family that she needed emergency cardiac surgery for a condition that could have been managed with medication. The prosecution presented evidence that Dr. Blackwood had performed 247 unnecessary or inappropriate cardiac procedures between 2003 and 2005, resulting in 31 patient deaths and generating over $4.2 million in fraudulent insurance billings. Emily's documentation had been meticulous, and every case she had flagged was confirmed by independent medical review. The timeline of Emily's murder was established through a combination of security camera footage, cell phone records, and forensic evidence. The prosecution showed that Dr. Blackwood had left Mass General at 9:43 p.m. on November 24, 2005, driving his BMW sedan. Security cameras captured Emily leaving the hospital at 9:15 p.m., but she never reached her car in the parking garage. Forensic evidence suggested that Emily had been approached in the parking garage, likely by someone she trusted, and had been convinced to get into Dr. Blackwood's car. Fiber evidence and DNA found in his BMW confirmed that Emily had been in the vehicle, and the medical examiner testified that she had been strangled sometime between 9:30 and 11:00 p.m. that night. The prosecution theorized that Dr. Blackwood had lured Emily to his car under the pretense of discussing their earlier conversations about his surgical practices, then killed her when she refused to abandon her investigation. Her body had been transported to his Cape Cod cottage, where it had remained buried for 16 months. Dr. Blackwood's own behavior following Emily's disappearance proved equally damning. The prosecution presented evidence that he had accessed Emily's hospital computer account multiple times after her disappearance, searching for files related to his surgical cases. He had also made several unexplained trips to Cape Cod in the weeks following her murder, trips that coincided with the purchase of concrete and gardening supplies that were used to conceal her grave. Perhaps most damaging was Dr. Blackwood's own testimony. Against his lawyer's advice, he insisted on taking the stand to defend his medical practices and deny any involvement in Emily's death. But under cross-examination by ADA Fleming, his story fell apart. "Dr. Blackwood, you've testified that your surgical recommendations were always based on sound medical judgment," Fleming said. "Can you explain why Mrs. Chen's pre-surgical cardiac catheterization showed only 20% arterial blockage, but you recommended a triple bypass surgery?" "Sometimes, Doctor," Blackwood replied, visibly sweating. "We have to be proactive in cardiac medicine. Waiting for blockages to worsen can be fatal. But, Doctor, medical guidelines clearly state that bypass surgery is not recommended unless arterial blockage exceeds 70%. Are you saying that medical guidelines don't apply to your patients?" Every case is different. I was using my clinical judgment. Clinical judgment or billing judgment, doctor. Mrs. Chen's triple bypass surgery generated $87,000 in insurance payments. A medication regimen would have cost less than $200 per month. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and the jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: first-degree murder, medical fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of corpse. Dr. Richard Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdicts were read, David Hartwell sat in the courtroom with Sarah and Michael, now 11 and 8 years old. For the first time since Emily's disappearance, he felt something approaching peace. Justice had been served, not just for Emily, but for all of Dr. Blackwood's victims. But even as the trial ended, the broader implications of the case continued to reverberate through Boston's medical community and beyond. The conviction of Dr. Richard Blackwood sent shockwaves through Massachusetts General Hospital and the broader medical community that extended far beyond the courtroom where justice had finally been served. What had begun as the search for a missing doctor had exposed systemic failures in medical oversight that allowed a predatory surgeon to operate unchecked for years, killing patients for profit, while hospital administrators either looked the other way or actively enabled his crimes. Within weeks of Blackwood's sentencing, Mass General faced a cascade of lawsuits from families of his victims. The hospital's initial response was predictable. They claimed to be shocked by the revelations, insisted that Blackwood had acted alone, and maintained that their oversight procedures were adequate. But as more evidence emerged during the civil litigation process, it became clear that the hospital's senior leadership had been willfully blind to red flags that should have triggered investigations years earlier. Dr. Patricia Morrison, who had tried to support Emily's concerns before her murder, became a whistleblower who exposed the depth of institutional corruption. The administration knew, she testified in a federal investigation that began in early 2009, Richard Blackwood's surgical mortality rates were 3 times higher than the department average, but he was generating massive revenue for the hospital. When concerns were raised, they were dismissed or buried. The federal investigation revealed that Mass General's cardiac surgery program had generated over $47 million in revenue during the 3 years of Blackwood's fraud scheme. Hospital executives had received bonuses tied directly to surgical department profits, creating financial incentives to ignore medical ethics and patient safety. Several administrators, including the chief of surgery and the hospital administrator, were eventually charged with conspiracy and medical fraud. But the institutional reckoning extended beyond criminal charges. The Massachusetts State Medical Board conducted a comprehensive review of every cardiac surgery performed at Mass General between 2003 and 2005, ultimately determining that 247 procedures recommended by Dr. Blackwood were medically unnecessary. The board's final report concluded that the hospital had created an environment where profit was prioritized over patient welfare, and that systemic failures in oversight directly contributed to preventable patient deaths. The human cost of these failures was staggering. Independent medical review determined that 31 patients had died as a direct result of unnecessary surgeries performed by Dr. Blackwood, while dozens more had suffered serious complications from procedures they never should have undergone. The victims ranged in age from 52 to 89, most of them elderly patients who had trusted their doctor's recommendations without question. Maria Santos, the billing clerk who had been coerced into falsifying records, became a key witness in the federal case against hospital administrators. Her testimony revealed the pressure placed on hospital staff to maximize billing, even when they suspected something was wrong. I asked my supervisor about some of the procedures that didn't seem to match the patient files, Santos testified. She told me to stop asking questions, that doctors knew what they were doing, and that my job was to process billing, not to practice medicine. When I persisted, I was told that if I couldn't handle the responsibilities of my position, there were plenty of other people who could. The cover-up went deeper than anyone had initially realized. Email records subpoenaed during the federal investigation showed that hospital executives had been aware of complaints about Dr. Blackwood's practices as early as 2004, but had chosen to protect their most profitable surgeon rather than investigate potential patient safety issues. One particularly damning email, sent by the chief of surgery to the hospital administrator in March 2004, read, "Blackwood's numbers are off the charts again this quarter. Some of the residents are asking questions about his surgical recommendations, but we can't afford to lose his productivity. Suggest we move the questioning residents to other rotations and avoid any formal review processes that might create documentation." Emily's attempt to report her concerns through proper channels had been doomed from the start. The hospital's ethics committee, which was supposed to provide oversight of medical practices, had been deliberately staffed with physicians who were financially dependent on the administration's goodwill. When Emily submitted her formal complaint in September 2005, it was reviewed by doctors who knew that challenging Dr. Blackwood meant challenging the hospital's most profitable revenue stream. Dr. Morrison testified that Emily had become increasingly isolated in the weeks before her disappearance as word spread about her investigation. Other doctors started avoiding her, Morrison recalled. There was pressure from the administration to distance ourselves from Emily's disruptive behavior. Some of her colleagues were told that supporting her complaints could affect their own career advancement. The federal investigation ultimately resulted in criminal charges against 7 mass general administrators and a $127 million settlement with the Department of Health and Human Services for Medicare fraud. The hospital was also required to implement comprehensive oversight reforms and submit to federal monitoring for 5 years. But for the families of Dr. Blackwood's victims, no amount of money could compensate for their losses. Patricia Chen, whose mother had died following unnecessary surgery, became a leading advocate for medical oversight reform. "My mother trusted her doctor completely," Chen said at a congressional hearing on medical fraud in 2010. "She believed that if Dr. Blackwood said she needed surgery, then she needed surgery. She never imagined that a doctor would recommend a procedure that could kill her just to make money." If Emily Hartwell hadn't been brave enough to investigate, if her husband hadn't been determined enough to find the truth, Dr. Blackwood would still be killing patients today. The broader medical community also faced a reckoning. Medical schools began requiring courses on healthcare fraud recognition, and professional medical associations implemented new whistleblower protection programs for physicians who reported concerns about colleagues' practices. Emily's legacy became intertwined with medical reform movements across the country. The Emily Hartwell Medical Ethics Act, passed by the Massachusetts legislature in 2011, required hospitals to establish independent oversight committees with external medical experts and mandated transparency in surgical outcome reporting. David Hartwell, who had become an unexpected advocate for medical reform, testified in support of the legislation. "Emily died because she tried to protect patients from a predatory doctor," he told state lawmakers. "We can honor her memory by making sure that no other physician faces retaliation for speaking up about patient safety concerns." The institutional changes that followed Emily's case were significant, but they came at a terrible cost. 31 patients had died, a dedicated doctor had been murdered, and public trust in one of Boston's most prestigious hospitals had been shattered. The case served as a stark reminder that medical fraud isn't just about money, it's about life and death, and the systems designed to protect patients had failed catastrophically. As the various investigations and legal proceedings concluded, David Hartwell faced a different kind of reckoning, learning how to rebuild his family's life in the aftermath of tragedy and teaching his children that their mother's death had not been in vain. 5 years after Emily's murder, David Hartwell sat in his kitchen in Cambridge, watching his children Sarah and Michael eat breakfast before school, and marveled at their resilience. Sarah, now 13, had inherited her mother's fierce intelligence and sense of justice, often asking pointed questions about medical ethics that would make seasoned physicians uncomfortable. Michael, 10, still had nightmares occasionally, but he had also developed an unshakable faith in the importance of truth-telling that his therapist believed stemmed from understanding how his mother had died, trying to protect others. The years following Dr. Blackwood's conviction had been a complex journey of healing, advocacy, and learning to live with both grief and purpose. David had initially worried that knowing the brutal details of Emily's murder would traumatize his children further, but their therapist, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, had helped them understand that their mother had died as a hero, not a victim. "Children are remarkably adaptable," Dr. Martinez explained to David during one of their family sessions. "Sarah and Michael needed to understand that their mother's death had meaning, that she died protecting people. That knowledge has actually helped them process their grief more effectively than if they had continued to live with unanswered questions. The financial settlements from the various lawsuits had ensured that the family would never face economic hardship, but David had struggled with the moral complexity of profiting from Emily's death. He ultimately decided to donate the majority of the settlement money to establish the Emily Hartwell Foundation for Medical Ethics, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting healthcare whistleblowers and improving patient safety oversight. Emily would have wanted her death to prevent other families from going through what we went through, David explained to the Foundation's board of directors, which included Dr. Patricia Morrison and several other physicians who had worked to expose medical fraud in their own institutions. If we can save even one life by improving medical oversight, then Emily's sacrifice will have meaning. The Foundation's work had already made a significant impact. It provided financial support for healthcare workers who faced retaliation for reporting safety concerns, funded independent medical oversight programs at hospitals across New England, and lobbied for stronger legal protections for medical whistleblowers. By 2012, the Foundation had helped expose 3 additional cases of systematic medical fraud, preventing an estimated 400 unnecessary procedures. Sarah had become particularly involved in the Foundation's work, often speaking at medical ethics conferences about the importance of listening to concerns raised by younger physicians. My mum was told she was being overly emotional when she tried to report Dr. Blackwood, Sarah told a conference of medical students at Harvard in 2011. She was told to focus on her own patients and stop questioning her supervisor. If the hospital had listened to her, 31 people would still be alive today. Michael had channeled his processing of the tragedy in a different direction, becoming fascinated with forensic science and police work. He often told people that he wanted to become a detective like the ones who had solved his mother's case, though David suspected his interest was really about ensuring that truth prevailed over deception. The family had also maintained close relationships with some of Dr. Blackwood's other victims' families, finding comfort in shared understanding of their losses. Patricia Chen had become like a grandmother to Sarah and Michael, often joining the Hartwell family for holidays and special occasions. "We're all survivors of Richard Blackwood," Patricia would say. "We need to take care of each other." But healing hadn't been linear or simple. David had struggled with depression and anger for years after Emily's murder, sometimes questioning whether he had done enough to protect her, whether he should have noticed signs of the danger she was facing. Therapy had helped him understand that Emily had deliberately kept her investigation secret to protect her family, and that there was nothing he could have done differently. Emily made a choice to pursue the truth, even when it became dangerous. Dr. Martinez had told David during one particularly difficult session, she chose to protect her patients over protecting herself. You can honor that choice by living the life she would have wanted you to live, not by torturing yourself with hypothetical scenarios. The children had also faced unique challenges. Sarah had gone through a period of intense anxiety about medical care, refusing to see doctors for routine checkups because she associated hospitals with her mother's death. It had taken months of therapy and gradual exposure to positive medical experiences to help her overcome that fear. Michael had struggled with trust issues, particularly with authority figures. He had difficulty believing that adults in positions of power were telling him the truth, a skepticism that was both protective and potentially problematic as he navigated school and social relationships. Both children had also dealt with the strange celebrity that came with their mother's case. Emily's story had been featured in multiple true crime documentaries, and the family occasionally encountered people who recognized them from media coverage. Sarah, in particular, had learned to set firm boundaries about discussing her mother's death with strangers or classmates who were curious about the case. The 5th anniversary of Emily's murder, in November 2010, had marked a turning point for the family. Instead of treating it as a day of mourning, they had decided to celebrate Emily's life and impact by hosting the first annual Emily Hartwell Medical Ethics Symposium at Harvard Medical School. Mum always said that the best way to honor someone's memory was to continue their work, Sarah had said in her speech opening the symposium. She was working to protect patients when she died. We're going to keep doing that work, not just for her, but for all the people who need someone to speak up for them when they can't speak for themselves. Dr. Blackwood, meanwhile, was serving his life sentence at MCI Cedar Junction, where he had been placed in protective custody after receiving death threats from other inmates whose family members had been victims of medical malpractice. His appeals had been denied, and his medical license had been permanently revoked. Prison records showed that he had refused to participate in any rehabilitation programs and continued to maintain his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his crimes. The broader institutional changes that had resulted from Emily's case were also showing measurable results. Massachusetts General Hospital had implemented comprehensive oversight reforms and had not had a single case of medical fraud reported since 2009. Similar reforms at hospitals across the country had led to a significant decrease in unnecessary surgical procedures and improved patient safety outcomes. But perhaps the most important measure of healing was something simpler and more personal. On a quiet Tuesday evening in March 2012, David found himself cooking dinner for his children and realized that for the first time in over 6 years, he felt genuinely happy. Not just content or coping, but actually happy. Sarah was at the kitchen table doing homework and asking Michael to help her with math problems. Michael was building something with Legos while providing commentary on Sarah's algebra struggles. The house felt warm and alive, filled with the ordinary chaos of a family that had learned to function and even thrive despite experiencing unimaginable tragedy. "You know what? Mum would be proud of us," Sarah said suddenly, looking up from her textbook. It was the first time in years that mentioning Emily had felt natural rather than painful, integrated into their daily life rather than a sharp interruption of it. "Yeah," Michael agreed, not looking up from his Lego construction. "She'd probably tell us to clean up this kitchen, though." David laughed, and the sound surprised him with its authenticity. They were going to be okay. More than okay, they were going to honor Emily's memory by living full, purposeful lives and by never forgetting that the truth, no matter how dangerous, was always worth pursuing. 10 years after Emily Hartwell's murder, her story had become more than a true crime case. It had become a catalyst for systemic change in American healthcare and a testament to the power of one person's courage to save countless lives. As David Hartwell stood at the podium of Harvard Medical School's largest auditorium in November 2015, addressing an audience of medical students, doctors, and healthcare administrators, he reflected on how far they had all come from that terrible Thanksgiving night in 2005. "My wife Emily believed that medicine was fundamentally about protecting the vulnerable," David began his keynote address at the 10th annual Emily Hartwell Medical Ethics Symposium. "She died because she refused to let that protection be compromised by greed, ego, or institutional indifference. Today, 10 years later, we gather not just to remember her sacrifice, but to celebrate the lives that have been saved because she had the courage to speak truth to power." The numbers were staggering. Independent studies conducted by the Massachusetts Medical Society estimated that the oversight reforms implemented in the wake of Emily's case had prevented over 2,400 unnecessary surgical procedures across New England alone. Similar reforms adopted by hospitals nationwide had potentially saved thousands of lives and billions of dollars in fraudulent medical billing. Sarah Hartwell, now 18 and a freshman at Harvard studying biomedical ethics, had become a powerful voice in the medical reform movement. Her speech at the symposium that year focused on the ongoing challenges facing young physicians who witness unethical practices. "Medical school teaches us about the Hippocratic Oath about do no harm," Sarah told the audience, "but it doesn't always prepare us for what to do when we discover that colleagues are causing harm. My mother faced that situation, and she chose to act even when it became dangerous. We need to create systems that protect future Emily Hartwells, so they don't have to choose between speaking up and staying safe." The Emily Hartwell Foundation had grown into one of the most respected medical watchdog organizations in the country. Under the leadership of Dr. Patricia Morrison, who had left Mass General to become the foundation's executive director, it had investigated dozens of healthcare fraud cases and provided support for over 300 medical whistleblowers. One of the foundation's most significant achievements was the development of anonymous reporting systems that allowed healthcare workers to report concerns about patient safety without fear of retaliation. These systems, now implemented in over 400 hospitals across the United States, had led to the early detection and prevention of multiple fraud schemes similar to Dr. Blackwood's. Michael Hartwell, now 15 and a sophomore in high school, had indeed pursued his interest in forensic science and criminal justice. He frequently volunteered with the foundation, helping to organize educational events and speaking to other young people about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. "People sometimes ask me if I'm angry about what happened to my mom," Michael said in an interview with Boston Magazine in 2015. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm determined. I'm determined to make sure that the kind of evil that Dr. Blackwood represented can't hide in places that are supposed to help people." Dr. Richard Blackwood had died in prison in 2013, 8 years into his life sentence. His death was ruled a suicide, though some suspected that fellow inmates had played a role. His final letter, released by prison officials, contained no apology or expression of remorse, only continued insistence that his surgical decisions had been medically justified. The broader impact of Emily's case extended beyond healthcare reform. Law schools across the country began using the Hartwell case as a study in the intersection of professional ethics, whistleblower protection, and institutional corruption. The case had also influenced federal legislation, including the Healthcare Fraud Prevention Act of 2014, which strengthened penalties for medical fraud and expanded protections for healthcare whistleblowers. Perhaps most importantly, Emily's story had changed the culture of medicine itself. Medical schools now required courses on healthcare ethics and fraud recognition. Professional medical associations had established robust support systems for physicians who reported concerns about colleagues' practices. The stigma that had once surrounded medical whistleblowing had largely disappeared, replaced by recognition that protecting patients was every healthcare provider's responsibility. Dr. Morrison reflected on this cultural shift during her remarks at the 2015 symposium. "When Emily first came to me with her concerns about Dr. Blackwood, I supported her privately but didn't speak up publicly. I was afraid for my own career, afraid of being labeled a troublemaker. Emily's death taught me that sometimes being a troublemaker is exactly what patients need from their doctors." The legal aftermath of the case had also continued to evolve. Mass General had paid over $200 million in settlements to families of Dr. Blackwood's victims, and the hospital had undergone complete restructuring of its oversight systems. Several former administrators had served prison sentences for their roles in covering up Blackwood's crimes, and the hospital's new leadership had implemented transparency measures that made it a model for ethical healthcare administration. The families of Dr. Blackwood's victims had also formed lasting bonds with the Hartwell family. Patricia Chen, now in her 80s, had become a tireless advocate for elderly patients' rights and frequently spoke about the need for family members to ask questions about medical recommendations. "My mother died because we trusted blindly," Chen often said in her advocacy work. "Trust is important in medicine, but so is asking questions, getting second opinions, and making sure that recommended treatments make sense. If we had known to ask those questions, my mother might still be alive." The ripple effects of Emily's courage had even reached international healthcare systems. European medical organizations had studied the reforms implemented in the wake of her case and had adopted similar oversight mechanisms. The World Health Organization had cited the Emily Hartwell case as a model for how institutional changes could prevent healthcare fraud and improve patient safety globally. As David concluded his remarks at the 2015 symposium, he shared a personal reflection about how Emily would have viewed her legacy. Emily was a deeply humble person who believed that doing the right thing shouldn't require special recognition, he said. If she could see what has grown from her sacrifice, the lives saved, the systems reformed, the culture changed, I think she would be amazed that one person's decision to stand up for patients could have such far-reaching impact. But I also think she would remind us that the work isn't finished. As long as there are vulnerable patients and powerful institutions, there will be a need for people with Emily's courage to speak up when something is wrong. The symposium concluded with the presentation of the annual Emily Hartwell Award for Medical Courage, given to healthcare providers who had demonstrated exceptional bravery in protecting patient safety. The 2015 recipient was Dr. Marcus Webb, a surgeon in Chicago who had exposed a scheme involving unnecessary spinal surgeries at his hospital, despite facing threats to his career and personal safety. As Dr. Webb accepted the award, He spoke directly to the young medical students in the audience. Dr. Emily Hartwell showed us that being a physician sometimes means risking everything to protect our patients. If you take nothing else from medical school, remember that your primary obligation is always to the people who trust you with their lives. Sometimes that trust will require you to be brave. Be brave. As the audience rose in a standing ovation, David Hartwell looked out at the faces of future doctors, nurses, and healthcare administrators who would carry Emily's legacy forward. His wife had died believing that one person could make a difference in protecting patients from harm. 10 years later, her belief had been proven right in ways she never could have imagined. Emily Hartwell's courage had echoed across a decade, saving lives, reforming systems, and proving that the truth, no matter how dangerous to pursue, always has the power to heal the world. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases across America. Thank you for following Emily Hartwell's story. See you in the next video.